It's the patriarch of all stadiums. A 2,000-year-old masterpiece that contemporary designers still regard with awe. It may have held as many as 80,000 people, and it shook for centuries with a savage entertainment that continues to fascinate and appall. 1,000 gladiators are said to have died here in a single day. Now, the Colosseum on Modern Marvels. Nothing evokes the greatness and brutality of ancient Rome better than the fallen giant known as the Colosseum. This was once the heartbeat of an empire, where huge crowds reveled in gladiatorial combat that reflected and reinforced a larger Roman drama of warfare and conquest, of life and death. In terms of size and scale, this 2,000-year-old stadium with its 4 levels and 80 entrances would be impressive if it were built today. With a capacity that some experts put between 50,000 to 80,000 people, the Colosseum is still one of the largest stadiums in the world, rivaling such arenas as Giant Stadium in New Jersey. It's a structural wonder that was built nearly 2 millennia ahead of its time.
This kind of theaters and amphitheaters were realized all over the world during the Roman dominion, but no one ever reached this dimension. From the structural point of view, that was a very relevant accomplishment.
It was very impressive 2,000 years ago, as it is today, perhaps even more so, because now we are used to it through our information channels. But there was no television 2,000 years ago, so people, when they came to Rome, that is the first time they actually saw the whole building.
There's a wonderful line that's as long as the Colosseum stands, Rome will stand, and when the Colosseum falls, Rome will fall, and when Rome falls, the world falls. You can't do any better than that as far as a building's concerned.
More than 160 feet high, 617 feet long, and 512 feet wide, the Colosseum was state-of-the-art until very recent times. It featured a retractable roof that blocked out the sun, and a maze of sophisticated underground staging devices, including elevators and trapdoors that made possible the production of antiquity's most spectacular gladiatorial games. Of course, the Colosseum is more than a stadium. It's an echo chamber that reverberates through history with the roar of a crowd celebrating bloody spectacle as public sport.
When you compare it to a building like the Pantheon, for example, or the Vatican, I mean, there's a quietness about those buildings. But quiet is not what you think when you walk up to the Colosseum. You can just hear 50,000 people and see them streaming to that place. It is so clearly a gathering place, and again, an incredible memory that the building has of all of the events that happened there.
Tens of thousands of gladiators died here, along with vast numbers of prisoners of war and criminals who were executed in a variety of horrific ways. Countless lions, tigers, elephants, panthers, and other exotic animals were also slaughtered. The world still struggles to reconcile how Rome, which saw itself as the great civilizing power of its time, could revel in killing on such a scale for nearly 5 centuries as a form of entertainment.
I believe that the Romans enjoyed it, and it was exciting. It's a bit like we look now at the television and we had all these Terminators killing people, then we think it is, of course, a virtual reality, and we don't think about it. I don't think the Romans thought that it was more than that. I think it is just another television show.
The Colosseum wasn't called the Colosseum until many centuries after it was built. In its prime, it was called the Flavian Amphitheater, in honor of the imperial family that authorized its construction. Much like stadiums today take on the names of their corporate sponsors. It acquired the name Colosseum long after it had closed, from an enormous 120-foot statue of Nero called the Colossus that loomed nearby. Nothing remains of the statue, but a fragment of the massive pedestal on which it stood is still in place just outside the Colosseum's western facade. The Flavian Amphitheater, or Double Theater, was designed specifically to give audiences a better view of gladiatorial games. It was hardly the Roman Empire's first arena, as amphitheaters probably appeared as early as the 3rd century BC. Early amphitheaters were simple, made of either wood or stone. This stone amphitheater, with a capacity of 12,000 people, was built in Pompeii around 70 BC. A century later, Rome still didn't have a large permanent amphitheater, which historians consider odd because of Rome's great size. About 1 million people lived there, more than 3 times as many as Alexandria, its nearest rival. In many ways, Rome was more like a modern city than an ancient one, and teemed with a restless population that was hungry for diversion. Around 70 AD, the new emperor, Vespasian, decided to provide some of the diversion by building an amphitheater worthy of the imperial capital. The architects who designed the new amphitheater faced an enormous set of challenges. To hold so many people, the stadium had to be 4 levels high, with seating on the first 3 and standing room at the top. The outer facade would be classical, even by ancient standards, with repeating tiers of arches and decorated columns laid out according to traditional rules of design. 80 entrances, 76 of them numbered, would make it easy for huge crowds to get in and out of the amphitheater. Everything about the Colosseum's inner design was also organized with traffic flow in mind. A system of passageways corresponding to the entrances, multiple stairways, and a series of concentric walls creating lanes of traffic on all 4 levels would make it easy for people to get to their seats. One of the first and most daunting challenges the Colosseum's builders faced was quarrying and hauling the stone for the stadium's outer wall. A local form of limestone called travertine was cut into 8 by 3 foot blocks and carried 20 miles from a quarry in the neighboring town of Tivoli. Tivoli still exists, and so do its ancient quarries, which yielded the 100,000 cubic feet of travertine, weighing 7,500 tons, for the Colosseum's facade.
I cannot conceive what 100,000 cubic feet would look like, but it sounds absolutely enormous. If you think about it, this would be acres of stone in that one building.
The Romans built a special road just to transport the Colosseum stone, and 200 ox carts made the trip each day. 240,000 cartloads in all. The other major materials used to build the Colosseum were 300 tons of iron, which were used to clamp the blocks into place, tufa, a light but strong local stone, and brick.
It's an integrated system of materials with different structural capacities used in a hierarchical way. They have used travertine piers. Travertine is a kind of limestone. They've used tufa walls, a volcanic stone, not as good as travertine, but still pretty good. Then brick-faced concrete. So this system stitched the whole building together in a fully integrated whole.
Very little is known about the equipment the Romans used to build the Colosseum. How, for example, could they lift such heavy blocks of stone to such a lofty height? One tantalizing image from the gravestone of a contractor commissioned to build a quarter of the Colosseum gives us a glimpse.
It is a very impressive scene of a massive crane which is hauling blocks up with pulleys. The crane is actually operated by a kind of revolving wheel with slaves treading, a treadmill type of arrangement to rotate the crane into position.
The Colosseum took about 10 years to build. Not a bad speed by contemporary standards, but an astonishing one 2,000 years ago.
They didn't have computers, and they didn't have electrical tools or so, and the building is gigantic. And any number of little errors and glitches must have happened that slowed down the construction, but despite all that, they were able to coordinate their building efforts.
Such efforts would be put to an equally difficult test in the design and construction of the labyrinthine underworld of the Colosseum. Gladiators once moved through these narrow passageways, along with stagehands, animal handlers, lions, crocodiles, elephants, and other wild beasts from the far reaches of the Roman Empire. 2 floors worth of twisting corridors and cul-de-sacs were once hidden beneath the arena floor. It once bustled with all the behind-the-scenes activity that made the gladiatorial games and other deadly spectacles possible. Domitian, the younger son of the Emperor Vespasian, built this netherworld, called the Hypogeum, or underground, when he became emperor in 81 AD.
We have to think of a normal theater. Big activities, many people. Here, someone is running there, something else is moving ropes, something else is preparing costumes. So let's imagine this very crowded atmosphere down here.
The idea that it truly is a labyrinth is amazing because it's not only an engineering marvel, it's an operational marvel. It truly was this intricate set of passageways that helped to host the event and enhance the spectacle of it. But interestingly enough, if you peeled off the basketball floor or the hockey floor of a modern-day arena, it would look pretty much the same.
Archaeologists have been piecing together the complex story of the Colosseum substructure since scientific excavation began in the 1870s. A fascinating part of that story involves the elevators that carried gladiators, animals, and scenery to the arena floor. 32 elevators, specially designed for lions, panthers, and other dangerous animals, ringed the arena at the level of the Hypogeum.
They were brought up from the lower floor in cages, probably operated by some kind of counterpoise system, in which the weight is released and the cage rises. The animal emerged, attracted by the light, and no doubt there was some kind of bait at the top of the ramp, which might have encouraged him to charge.
Larger hinged platforms or ramps called pegmata were located in the center of the arena. Counterweights were used to lift elephants and other massive animals, as well as spectacular scenery, including forests and mountains.
We have no exact idea about how they could recreate in few seconds, for instance, the volcano Vesuvio. We know that in 3rd century AD, the volcano was rebuilt inside the arena of the Colosseum, and that it appeared suddenly in a triumph of fire and lava. It's unbelievable. But they did it.
In addition to the Hypogeum, ancient engineers would add an impressive feature to the Colosseum that modern stadium designers only began to implement in the late 20th century: a retractable roof. An inscription found at the Colosseum suggests that the stadium was financed with the plunder of Jerusalem, which Rome conquered in 70 AD. The Colosseum will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to the Colosseum on Modern Marvels. Retractable roofs are the latest technological trend in today's sports stadiums. Their ingenious design never ceases to awe and amaze spectators. Few who see them in action ever suspect that the granddaddy of these seemingly modern inventions was an integral part of the Colosseum over 2,000 years ago. The Valerium, as it was called, was made of cloth and unfurled by a detachment of 300 imperial sailors permanently stationed outside the Colosseum. The awning protected spectators from the burning Mediterranean sun.
Waiting for hours all day in the summer, it's not easy. So the Valerium was a great gift of the Flavian Emperor to the Romans.
While the Valerium itself has long vanished, physical evidence attesting to its existence is easy to find in the form of brackets that circle the Colosseum's facade, 240 of them in all. Each bracket held a tall beam of wood, much like the mast of a ship. Scholars believe that at a signal, the sailors pulled a massive rope framework into place. A 24-ton colored canvas was then unfurled, covering 2/3 of the arena and leaving the center above the floor exposed. Traces of the stairways the sailors used to get to their positions inside the Colosseum wall can still be seen. Not much is definitively known about how the velarium worked. Indeed, archaeologists have yet to postulate a credible design that explains how such a large awning could have worked given the wind stresses involved.
We know how broadly the velarium worked, that the system of ropes and pulleys could open it and close it, and probably open and close different parts separately, that you didn't have to open the whole thing at once and close it all. But these are still generalities. Exactly how they were attached to the velabrum and where the sailors stood and how they pulled it, that we don't know.
In 80 AD, the Colosseum opened in spectacular style, with 100 days of gladiatorial games. 5,000 animals and an unknown number of men perished during a single day of the inaugural Bloodfest. For the first 2 years of the Colosseum's life, before Domitian added the hypogeum, gladiators actually fought on water, in mock recreations of famous naval battles.
The arena that in the first phase was completely wooden was dismantled in few hours, and then the basin was flooded because it was connected with an aqueduct, and in few hours spectators could observe ships fighting inside the Colosseum.
Admission to the Colosseum was free. City officials distributed tickets in the form of pottery shards. A number on each ticket indicated which of the arched entrances to go through. Ancient audiences were greeted with lavish decoration that has long since vanished. Archaeologists, however, have unearthed some intriguing fragments, including ancient statuary and column capitals. Many of the artifacts are now stored in an underground chamber, off limits to the public. Floral and mythological decorations like these once adorned the Colosseum's stairways and walls. An ancient graffiti artist etched this laurel branch in stone for a victorious gladiator named Amato. More than anything, the Colosseum was full of inscriptions, mostly related to identifying exactly who had the right to sit in the best seats.
Behind me you can see an example of a senatorial inscription. That means a stone where they carved the names of the senators who had reserved seats in the first rows of the amphitheater. And on this stone you can read the names of 3 senators. You can see also the names of senators who had these seats before and whose names were erased once they died or they changed place.
Seating was based strictly on social class. The emperor and VIPs sat on a 12-foot-high stepped marble platform on the first level. Iron bars and netting protected them from animals, weapons, and gore. Middle-class citizens sat on the second level. Lower-class citizens sat on the third. The top level, with steep wooden bleachers and standing room at the back, was reserved for women, the poor, and slaves. Seats were made of marble, only a few fragments of which remain. And remnants of huge blocks of inscriptions, erected after a particularly strong earthquake in the 5th century, still circle the rim of the arena floor. Wealthy citizens who paid for the repairs proudly inscribed their names on these large slabs, very much like the advertising banners of sponsors in today's stadiums.
The inscription was a monumental inscription with very, very big letters carved on marble blocks that were put all around the arena. And the inscription was in 2 copies so that the public could read it from each side of the amphitheater.
The ancient spectators that once packed the Colosseum could make their way in and out of the stadium with speed and ease, avoiding the chaos many modern crowds confront as they enter and exit today's arenas.
Modern estimations have been something like you could empty that place, within 12 minutes or something like that. I mean, that's mind-boggling, isn't it? People could leave their seats, go to the nearest exit, go down steps and ramps, and exit all along the 360-degree circumference of the building to get dispersed into the great city. And that really was the great achievement of planning of the Colosseum.
The people who poured into the Colosseum no doubt marveled at the magnificent structure as they raced to their seats. But what they really came to see were the main attractions of the games: the gladiators, animals, and executions in the arena. Archaeologists have found evidence of 110 drinking fountains and 2 very large lavatories in the Colosseum. The Colosseum will return on Modern Marvels, here on the History Channel. We now return to the Colosseum on Modern Marvels. The Colosseum was not the only amphitheater in Rome. In fact, another arena was right next door. The Ludus Magnus, where gladiators who fought in the Colosseum lived and trained. The fighters, along with their trainers and doctors, lived in barracks around the perimeter of the Ludus Magnus. 3,000 people could watch as they practiced on a fighting field that was less than a third smaller than the one in the Colosseum.
Consider that the size of the Ludus Magnus is more or less the same size of an amphitheater in a normal town of the empire. We're in Rome, we have the Colosseum. Other cities, they have amphitheaters as big as our Ludus Magnus.
From the Ludus Magnus, gladiators marched through an underground tunnel toward the Colosseum, all too aware that death might very well await ahead. One misstep in the savage combat about to begin, one slow reflex or brief lapse of judgment, could be instantly fatal. Such fears no doubt swirled in the minds of those who made their dramatic entry onto the field of battle.
You must have felt very much alone on that arena floor. 50,000 people, and every one of those people has come not because they're ever going to exhibit any compassion or pity for you, but because they want to see you suffer, they want to see you injured, they want to see you die. And to be there and looking up and seeing, 50,000 pairs of eyes looking down at you.
By the time the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, gladiatorial combat had become mass entertainment. But the roots of the gladiator go back to the 4th century BC and the Etruscans, a powerful civilization south of Rome.
They seem to have developed from funerary games, where a major warrior died, and then in memory of him, gladiators would fight to the death.
The religious origins and entertainment appeal of the savage ritual led the Romans to coin 2 distinct words for gladiatorial combat: munera, originally meaning rites in honor of the dead, and ludi, or games. The Colosseum, of course, was the ultimate stage for gladiatorial games, animal hunts, and other blood sport, which would last from dawn until dark. The first blood of the day belonged to condemned criminals, many of whom died by crucifixion. To make the executions more entertaining, Colosseum officials often forced the victims to perform in special plays known as fatal charades.
The person who was to be executed was made to play a role in a drama. And of course, at the end of the drama, the person was going to die, but as opposed to an actor on a stage, the death was very real, and that the person was executed as the part of the drama.
The main event, signaled by a flourish from trumpets, showcased the gladiators. They specialized in 20 different styles and forms of fighting, representing the techniques of Rome's far-flung conquered enemies. One of the most popular matchups pitted combatants called rhetari, who fought naked with just a trident and a net, against heavily armored Samnites, named after an Italian people defeated by the Romans in the 3rd century BC.
If the net fighter could throw his net over the gladiator and tangle him up, and then he had a trident with which he could stab the gladiator. However, of course, if the net fighter's trident broke or if he dropped his net, he was obviously in an extremely vulnerable position because he had no protective armor. But the Romans liked to see these kinds of matches where you had two totally different body types, two different skills, two different kinds of equipment.
A wounded gladiator would lay down his weapon and ask for his life. He was judged by the crowd according to his bravery and skill. Surprisingly, many experts now believe that the thumbs-up verdict of the crowd has been misinterpreted for centuries.
Thumbs up is not actually success. Rather, the thumb was up and in towards the chest, and that was the sign of deliver the final blow, stab him in the chest, you see. Or the other one was the thumb down and out, and that indicated throw the sword down and let him off. So those were the two options, and it was up to the emperor to decide which it was to be.
A fallen gladiator who was condemned did what he had taken an oath to do. He assumed the posture of one who was about to die and received the death blow. Two attendants then examined the body.
I had to be checked that he wasn't faking it. You see, if you might pretend you're dead and get off with it, but just to ensure that that wasn't happening, a slave came along with a branding iron, and if the corpse just lay prostrate with the branding, that was pretty secure. He was dead. But if his legs started to flail around and he screamed, then he was faking it. And of course he would be killed anyway, just to make sure that the job was done.
The dead body was dragged through the Porta Libitinaria, or Gate of Death. Contrary to popular notions, a gladiatorial match didn't always result in a death. Training and maintaining gladiators was expensive, and the institution of the games couldn't have survived if half the fighters died in every round of combat. In fact, talented gladiators probably fought like boxers today, twice a year, and had a reasonably good chance of a lengthy career. Funerary inscriptions of gladiators boast of dozens of fights. Great fighters were the superstars and sex symbols of their day. Their allure was so great that a number of Romans voluntarily took the oath to fight to the death. And one emperor, Commodus, appeared in the Colosseum no less than 735 times. Other than the gladiators, exotic and dangerous animals were the main attractions in the Colosseum. The Romans killed so many animals in the Colosseum and other imperial arenas that they spurred the creation of a thriving industry of big game hunting and transport. Hunters exterminated entire species, like the North African elephant and the Caspian tiger. Exotic animals were frequently used to kill prisoners who had been condemned ad bestias. Sometimes they were massacred hundreds at a time in lavishly recreated hunts that reaffirmed the power of the empire to the hometown crowd.
This is a form of conspicuous consumption, maybe taken to one of its most ultimate levels, that you would spare no expense to entertain the Roman people. That this is the entitlement that the Roman people have. It's the success of their empire has made them so wealthy and has given them the kind of power that they can go to these other countries and say, you know, we're taking these animals from you and we're taking them back to Rome. And then that you just put them there in front of the audience and you kill them and you say, you people are worth it, you residents of Rome. You deserve this kind of entertainment.
In the truest sense, the Colosseum was a theater of blood, played out before the hoarse shouts of a huge crowd, enthralled by this form of mass entertainment. How do we explain such bloody revels, such barbarous fun? Certainly the atmosphere inside the Colosseum must have been overwhelming, irresistible in its own gruesome way. No less a figure than the Christian theologian St. Augustine testified to its seductive power, describing the struggle of a religious friend who was dragged against his will to the games.
He shut his eyes and he tried to divert himself with his pure thoughts from the noise and the screaming and the cheering that was going on and the mayhem that was going on all around him. And then there was one almighty roar from the crowd, and he just couldn't keep his eyes closed. He had to see. His curiosity got the better of him. And that was the end of him. He became even more devoted to the arena and started to bring his friends along. And there's something absolutely hypnotic about it. It's addictive. I wouldn't want to see myself in that role, ending up like him, but who knows what one would do in faced with this type of excitement.
In the centuries following the demise of the Games, millions of tourists would mull that very question. And engineers would make Herculean efforts to keep the Colosseum from collapsing. Contrary to popular belief, there is no conclusive evidence that Christians were systematically fed to the lions in the Colosseum, although they were put to death in many other amphitheaters. The Colosseum will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to the Colosseum on Modern Marvels. The Roman Colosseum held standing room-only crowds for gladiatorial death matches, animal massacres, and public executions for nearly 5 centuries. Imagine if Yankee Stadium or Fenway Park had been around that long, packed to the rafters with screaming fans since the 1500s. Inevitably, the Colosseum suffered its share of disasters over such a long span. Perhaps the greatest was caused by a fire that gutted the stadium in 217 AD, destroying the roof, the floor, and the underground substructure. The fire burned so hot, it also melted much of the Colosseum limestone. Builders worked 20 years to reconstruct the amphitheater, twice the time it took to build it. By the late 4th century AD, the Colosseum's glory days were over, as the gladiatorial games and the Roman Empire both began to decline. Rome no longer had the resources to mount such lavish entertainments.
It would be nice to think that this decline was somehow correlative to the rise of Christianity at the same period in the 4th and the 5th century AD. But in fact, it was probably largely a financial matter, that these games got to be much too expensive to produce at a time when the economy of the Roman Empire was declining.
But the rise of Christianity probably did play a small role in silencing the Colosseum. The religion which the Emperor Constantine legalized in 313 AD became more and more influential, and devout Christians abhorred gladiatorial games. In 391 AD, a Greek monk named Telemachus flung himself into the arena and tried to separate 2 gladiators in mid-fight. The inflamed audience stoned Telemachus to death. 13 years later, in 404 AD, the games were finally banned. The Colosseum stayed open for another century, attracting smaller and smaller crowds and offering increasingly tawdry animal fights, featuring domestic animals like dogs and cocks.
That means that the idea itself of the show inside the Colosseum has greatly changed. In the final phases of life at the Colosseum, we should imagine these shows very close to our idea of circus, more than the classical idea of man fighting a tiger.
The last recorded event involving wild beasts took place in 523 AD. The long life of the Colosseum as an active stadium offering bloody spectacle to screaming fans was over. But the Colosseum's second, much longer life as a legendary ruin, put to all manner of uses and abuses, was about to begin. By the 12th century, when Rome's population had been reduced to just 25,000, a series of powerful families took over the Colosseum, turning it into a private fortress.
Any building that was secular was fair game to be transformed into a fortress. And amphitheaters are ideal because all you need to do is block up the arched entrances all the way around, and you've got yourselves a magnificent fortress. You've saved a lot of space where you don't have to build a wall.
In 1349, the Colosseum's fortress days came to a sudden end when an earthquake knocked down the southern facade, which originally extended to this line. The collapsed wall created a giant quarry of high-grade limestone that local builders immediately began to plunder.
There were thousands and thousands of cartloads of stone material which was sold by the popes to private contractors. A large part of Renaissance Rome, for example, was built out of the material of the Colosseum, and it was certainly used for the Basilica of St. Peter's in the 15th and 16th centuries.
In addition to the stone, scavengers removed every bit of iron from the Colosseum, pulling out all the clamps that held the travertine in place and further destabilizing the structure. To this day, nothing holds the Colosseum stone together except gravity and good design. During the Middle Ages, the Colosseum was considered a haunted place, possessed by pagan demons and the spirits of those who died in the arena. It was used as a wool factory, a gunpowder plant, a dumping ground, and a Christian shrine. By the end of the 18th century, the Colosseum had regained its renown as one of the most celebrated structures in the world. Travelers considered it an essential stop on the European Grand Tour. Poets and painters in particular fell in love with this evocative giant, which became a great symbol of 19th century Romanticism.
It was very romantic to take a walk inside the Colosseum, especially by night with the moon. This huge ruin represents the fall of an enormous empire, whose traces are still visible, but whose ruins are, in a certain way, forgotten.
Despite such interest, the Colosseum was in severe disrepair. In 1806, the eastern facade nearly collapsed after yet another earthquake.
So that gave the last push to actually start the restoration work. So the first thing, what was done in 1806, 1807, was to build a large brick buttress against this wall which was about to collapse, and just fix it as it was. So this ancient structure with all the fractures which can be seen today, it became like a monument not only of the Colosseum but of its own condition as well. So it was in a very, very fragile condition, and if they had not done this buttress, that part of the Colosseum would have gone.
In 1826, Roman authorities installed another emergency buttress. It functioned not only as a buttress, but also as a reconstruction of part of the Colosseum, including the crumbling southern facade. A third intervention decades later propped up the endangered western wall and rebuilt long-vanished arches and columns with red bricks that clearly differentiate themselves from the original travertine. At the turn of the 21st century, many more changes would be in store for the Colosseum. It would return to its roots as an entertainment venue and be reinvented as a modern symbol of compassion. Most of the marble seating in the Colosseum was stolen in the Middle Ages and recycled in palaces and churches throughout Rome. The Colosseum will return on Modern Marvels. We now return to the Colosseum on Modern Marvels. Today, the ancient killing field of the Colosseum is surprisingly full of life. But this greenery is nothing compared to the vegetation that flourished here in the 18th and 19th centuries. Every kind of flower, herb, and fruit could be found in the arena floor. A freakish cornucopia of plant life that had no business thriving in Rome.
It was completely overgrown. There were trees growing out of the walls, there were bushes. In fact, there was a whole while that books have been written about the bird life and the vegetation that choked the interior of the Colosseum.
How could the Colosseum give birth to such a varied profusion of plants? The most likely answer is that seeds dropped from the fur of the exotic animals fighting in the arena, or from the foreign spectators who brought native foods with them to eat during the games. Although visitors appreciated how the plants added greatly to the Colosseum's romantic air, engineers discovered that they were undermining the stadium's foundations. In 1870, every blade of grass was rooted out when archaeologists began the site's first major excavation. The 18th century Stations of the Cross were still in place as excavators began clearing away centuries-old debris that had filled in the underground passageways. In the 20th century, political pressure to use the Colosseum as a nationalistic symbol increased when the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini came to power. Mussolini saw himself as a direct link to the emperors of old, and he was so enamored with the power and mystique of the Colosseum that he actually held rallies on the exposed floor of the ruin. In 1943, crowds of a different sort gathered there to celebrate the fall of Mussolini, and in 1945, the end of World War II. After the war, archaeologists resumed their work and continued to make fascinating discoveries. They unearthed the bones of people who died in the arena and the skull of a bear pierced by a gladiator's sword. Through the centuries, the Colosseum has managed to survive just about everything from neglect to plunder to natural disasters to World War. But despite its aura of power and strength, the Colosseum is a fragile ruin. Less than half of the original structure still stands, and earthquakes continue to pose a devastating threat. Another quake could bring this symbol of eternal Rome crashing down.
It's delicate because the weight is huge and the dimensions are very large. As regards earthquake, the load is a bad component, and it was conceived to resist very well to vertical loads, to static loads. It's different when we have these huge horizontal forces.
Italy's foremost quake-proofing experts have been studying the Colosseum to determine how it will react to seismic stresses.
We are carrying out very up-to-date and sophisticated structural analysis to well understand this complex behavior of the Colosseum under the seismic actions. And that is necessary to do as less as possible, because the interventions have to balance the minimum as regards the respect of the historic value and the maximum to obtain safety levels. That is the challenge of the Colosseum.
Tourism, pollution, even the rumbling of traffic in the nearby subway all pose hazards to the Colosseum.
They may accelerate the aging process because the small vibration even can actually make it that the various cracks remain open, dust will go in, will increase it again, and if there is any earthquake or any other thing that will make it worse.
Not all the changes to the Colosseum have been damaging. People have long dreamed of reviving it as a theater of sorts. And in 2000, that dream was finally realized. The classic Greek tragedy, Oedipus Rex, was presented on a specially constructed stage that cost nearly $1 million and took 5 years to design and build. And in 2003, functioning much like any modern stadium, the Colosseum played host to a benefit concert by Paul McCartney, ushering in a contemporary role for the ancient arena. More than 1,900 years old, 1,500 years a ruin, the Colosseum continues to stir the imagination with its grandeur and its savage past. From the beginning, it has been a symbol as much as a structure, a symbol of antiquity, of empire, of Rome. Most of all, it's been a symbol of cruelty and death. But in recent years, death penalty opponents have sought to reverse that powerful aura. Each time a death sentence is carried out anywhere in the world, or when a state suspends or abolishes the death penalty, the Colosseum lights up the evening sky. For centuries, this impressive edifice conjured memories of Rome's savage past, a chilling reminder that empires are not built on compassion. Now the ruin with so much blood shed on its arena floor has come full circle. Take a stand for life and mercy.